Reading the beginning of the Gospel according to John. Questions addressed. Who is the narrator of the Gospel according to John? Does divine generation involve emanation in the vehicle of the Logos? Do we face God in Christ prior to our facing men? What does it mean to believe in His name? Who gives the Logos its name? Is Christ the name of Logos under the law? What does it mean to straighten the way of the Lord? The text. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and God was the Logos. He was in the beginning with God. All things were generated through him, and without him nothing generated was generated. In himself was life, and life was the light of men. And light shines in darkness, though darkness did not appropriate it. A man arose, sent by God, and whose name was John. He came to witness, so as to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. It was true light that illuminates all men who come into the world. He was in the world, and the world arose through him, and the world did not know him. He came into his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to however many welcomed him, he gave authority to become sons of God to those who believe in his name, who are born not from bloodlines, and neither from the will of the flesh, nor from the will of a man, but from God. And the Logos became flesh and dwelt in us, and we viewed the spectacle of his splendor, a splendor as of an only begotten from the Father, viewed full of grace and truth. John testified about this and hollered, saying, "This is the one of whom I said, he who comes after me arises before me, for he was prior to me." For we all draw from his plenitude and receive grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, while grace and truth arose through Jesus Christ. God no one has ever seen. The only begotten Son, who is in the Father's bosom, expounded him. And this is the testimony of John, when Jews from Jerusalem sent off priests and Levites before him to interrogate him, asking, "Who are you?" And he confessed and did not deny. And he confessed, "Not I am the Christ." And they interrogated him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you a prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Tell us who you are, so that we might give a response to those who dispatched us. What do you say of yourself?" He was speaking thus: "I am the solitary voice crying out in the wilderness, 'Straighten the way of the Lord,' as said the prophet Isaiah." With these words, John brings us back to the beginning. What does it mean to straighten the way of the Lord? Do we need to straighten the way of the Lord prior to adequately understanding the beginning? It would seem to be the case. Two alternatives are inadequate: the law without logos, and logos without law. But now the logos is a Greek term, and it is not identical to nomos, clearly, and yet it is related to nomos, to the law. Indeed, intimately related. It is by the law, it is facing, pros, in Greek, apud, the law. One cannot see the law without logos. And so through the logos we can see the law, but not without that mediation. And yet logos may appear outside of the law, and so incapable of providing access to the law, to the meaning, to the inner life of the law. A speech may then be required for us to approach the logos as it is in its proper function, and thus to appreciate it in a legal context. Now, let us return to the beginning. Enarche henologos. In the beginning was the logos. When is the beginning? The beginning is set in the past tense. Yet the beginning is eminently present to us, even as we are not present to it. Is our challenge that of recognizing the presence of the beginning, the parousia? Who are we? Who is the narrator? The narrator comes after John. John has prepared the path for the narrator. The narrator now sees how we should be speaking about logos and about law. He believes in the name of the logos. The name of the logos is Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ is not named in the beginning. For in the beginning, the Logos was with God, and God was the Logos. Prior to being named by God, the Logos belongs to God. The Logos is the Logos of the Nomos. The Logos was in the beginning with God. Nothing else, nothing other than the Logos. The Logos may then be said to be the true content of God. All things were generated through the Logos, and without the Logos, nothing generated was generated. Now, Generation is a term that reappears throughout the beginning of this Gospel according to John. The Greek text emphasizes a continuity between the primary act of God, gignomai, this generation, and our own way of being generated. We are ourselves generated fundamentally from God. And it is this fundamental dimension of man that is at stake here. Beyond our indebtedness to bloodlines, beyond our being defined by someone's finite will, we are defined directly by God. But this definition is, so to speak, logical. It comes through the Logos. In saying that we are generated, we're saying that we are alive, that we live. Thus, the importance of stressing that in the Logos itself was life in the beginning. So life in its primary instantiation, in its original sense, in its primal sense, in its foremost sense. In the Logos itself was life, or rather, life is primarily in Logos, and only derivatively not in Logos. It is the life of Logos, the life that therefore belongs to God, the life that is essentially in God. And life was the light of men. So, in the original sense, the light of men is in God. It is the light of the intellect. And light shines in darkness, scotia, in tenebris, though darkness did not. This shining is not in the past. Light merely shines in the present. Yet darkness is something that falls into the past and that belongs to the past, that belongs to death, that belongs to loss. And this realm of loss, this realm of darkness, is said to be incapable of appropriating the light, even though the light shines in it. So, if the light shines in the darkness to illuminate a form, let us say man, man in the dark is illuminated by the light, but fails to make the light his own. Egeneto anthropos, a man arose, sent by God, and whose name was John. The emphasis here is on the name. Onoma auto Ioannes. The name of man is given by God. The man is born in the respect that he is sent. He is on a mission. God sets us on a mission, and our birth is the sign of our derivation, of our source, of our mandate. What is crucial here is that our genesis is tied to our being named. We are called by God to live under the law. But now one man is named John. So in some respect, every man is John. John is a dimension of the anthropos. What dimension? What is the mandate of John? It is that of witnessing. What is he to witness? He is to witness the light. Rather, he is to give a testimony about the light. He is to point back to the light. Why? So that we might believe the light through John, through the voice that is John, the voice that points to the Logos, a voice that is named by the law. Thus, the goal here is for John to direct us to see the light under the law, but not only under the law, indeed the light at the heart of law, as the key to any appropriate, any genuine understanding of the law. Now, this voice that is named John cannot and clearly is not out to reduce the Logos to itself. It points to the Logos without trying to appropriate the Logos. For the Logos in question is the true light, lux vera, to phos to alethinon, that illuminates all men, panta anthropon, not only one anthropos. And who are all of these men? Who are all these panta anthropon? Well, they are those who come into the world. Erchomenum, esto cosmon. This is to say that they are not merely generated, they're generated in this precise manner. They come into the world of generation. They are thus not anthropos per se, as being at the beginning of generation. They belong to a multitude. The Logos, however, and so the primary, the absolutely primary instantiation of humanity, was in the world, and the world arose through him, and the world did not know him. Which is to say that man does not know himself. He does not know the primary sense of his humanity, his being proston theon, before God, in the company of God, in the face of God, in the presence of God. He thus, we can say, is fallen into the world, and all of these men, panta, all of them, are the world. And in this sense, the world did not know the Logos. It did not know itself. It did not know that the world is the home of the Logos, that it belongs to the Logos. The Logos is the Lord of the world. He came into his own, but his own did not receive him. Oi idioi, those who are as servants, did not welcome their landlord. Yet, to those who believed in his name, to them the Logos gave authority to become sons of God. Tekna theu. They are born from God. And this is the key. Those who live under the law and welcome the Logos in their lives as the key to their lives, and thus also to the interpretation of law, they are given authority to live as sons of God. For they define themselves beginning from God. They root themselves, they retrace themselves to God. And this is possible where law and logos both are retained. To these sons of God, who take their bearings from God, who are thus ektheu, or from God, ex Deo nati sunt, to these men is awarded genuine authority. Now, to those who recognize the Logos in the Nomos, there is no genesis, no birth, and thus no flesh aside from the Logos. The Logos shines within our birth itself, and the Logos became flesh and dwelt in us. These men are somehow reliving the beginning. How is this possible? It is possible because the light shines eternally, always, perpetually, constantly in the generative act. Even though we might fall into the past, into the dark, into darkness, thereby failing to recognize the Logos at the heart of Genesis. We viewed his splendor, the spectacle of his splendor. This is a theatrical scene of sorts. And what is it that is at the heart of this splendor? It is the Logos that is full of grace and truth, so that this splendor, this spectacle that fills our Genesis, our birth, our everyday life, is one that is given, and that in being given freely gives of itself, and thus it is full of truth. The Logos thus fills our life, so that there is no discrepancy, no contradiction between our Genesis, our life, and the law. And so John testified about this and hollered, saying, "This is the one of whom I said, 'He who comes after me arises before me.'" It is more important. Why? He is merely announcing, he's pointing back. And he's saying that what you will discover, thanks to me, thanks to this voice that I am, what you will discover through me is what is more important and primary, for he was prior to me. Quia prior me erat. Protos. The Logos is the prototype of John's voice. For we all draw from his plenitude and receive grace for grace, gratiam pro gratia, charinanti charistos. What does this suggest? It suggests that the grace, the gift, is drawing us back to the primary sense of our being. We are living in the plenitude of the Logos. To return to the Logos as the plenitude of our own lives, until we recognize that our life is entirely a gift from God. Hence the subsequent verse. For the law was given through Moses. Dia is this per in Latin, through Moses, while grace and truth arose through Jesus Christ. This is the first time Jesus Christ is named, and he's named in conjunction with the question of the law through Moses. Moses being evidently the prophet. Evidently as well, the law does not arise the way a man arises. It is not born, it is given. Whereas grace and truth arise. They arise into this world. They are born. But they are born through Jesus Christ and under the law, or to be under the law. We are all to be, we're called to be under the law. But what law? A law such as that which is given through Moses, paradigmatically. But how do we know this? How is this possible? Well, we do not know this unless it is through the Logos. It is through the Logos that we come to discern that the law that was given through Moses was given from God. Now, while Moses is a man and Jesus Christ is a man, Moses is a man in a distinct sense. Jesus Christ is the name of the grace and truth, which is to say of the content, of the Logos, that is the essential life of the law that comes through Moses. Moses himself, or the human being, the anthropos, as Moses, is not fully aware of the grace and truth that are at the heart of the law. Thus we read, God no one has ever seen. And that includes, of course, Moses, the only begotten Son, unigenitus filius, who is in the Father's bosom, expounded him. Ipse narravit. That is to say that it is the Logos that explains, that invites us to know, that makes it possible for us to know, and that thus presents God as knowable. Hence the shift from the seeing that no one has ever achieved, the seeing of God, to a knowing that comes through the Logos. So the Logos presents God not as an object to grasp, to appropriate into the dark, but as a mystery to return to, a mystery that is seated at the heart of the nomos, of the law, and that we encounter through the Logos and in Logos. So now the anthropos that is named John, so the human being as John, gives a testimony. And this is the testimony of John, reads the text. Now, those who follow the law, those in Jerusalem, dispatch their priests and their assistants to interrogate, to seek an answer to a precise question. Who is this man, John? More precisely, what is the nature of his voice? What is his function? What is the function of the anthropos here in this precise case? He is not in Jerusalem. What is he doing outside of Jerusalem? Is he outside of the law? Is he against the law? Is he a prophet who is speaking beyond the law? Is he someone who is decrying the corruption of people who are under the law? And John's answer is no. He is none of that. So, what do you say of yourself? And of course, this is a question that will be addressed to the Jesus of the Gospels as well. What do you say of yourself? In other words, what is your proper function? And John's answer is that he is none other than this solitary voice crying out in the desert. Why in the desert? Not in Jerusalem as such, but in the desert, in the wilderness, to straighten the way of the Lord. This is what we are to do in response to John's voice. John's voice, or John as this voice in the desert, is speaking as the prophet Isaiah, but he is not a prophet. Is he not speaking after the way of the prophet? He confesses this readily. But whereas the prophet Isaiah is preparing for the law, John is preparing for the Logos. Straighten the way of the Lord. The way belongs to the Lord. How can a man thus straighten what does not belong to him? This is possible where we do not recognize the nature of what is given to us, what does not belong to us. To straighten our way would be to redirect our lives back to its source, to recognize that the way itself stems from God, belongs to God, as we do. So this voice in the desert, in the wilderness, is crying out for a return to God through the Logos, and thus to a recognition of the immanence of the Logos in the law, in the life under the law. We are called to recognize that our own life, our own common way, is not something outside of the law or something over and against the law, but it is something that is given under the law, even though we do not recognize the law. So we might recognize Moses as the prophet of the law and say, well, this is all great. We have the law now. But still there will be a tension between law and our life. To straighten the way of the Lord would be to redirect our life toward law. But this is impossible as long as we see law as being pitted against our own lives. John, thus, is the voice that helps us live in harmony with law. This is achieved not merely by obeying the law, and clearly not by living as if there were no need for law above us. How then can John help us as he has done with the narrator of this gospel? How can he help us face the plenitude of grace and truth in our own birth? Now, this function of John is what throughout the centuries has been understood to be that of teachers of poetry. Dante Alighieri, in the first canto of his Inferno, speaks of a straight way, and his term diritta via, that has been lost, is tied to this imagery of the desert and of the wilderness. The terms are precisely those of the Latin Bible, the Latin text of the Gospels. What is at stake here for Dante, as for John, is the recovery of a true speech, of a true light, of a true logos. It is through this recovery alone that the opposition between life and law, between nature and law, can be overcome.